Hello and welcome to another edition of News for English Learners. Today, as usual, we'll be looking at an article from the news. This time is entitled Opioid Crisis, Supreme Scrutiny on Oxycontin Deal. And this article is basically about the big drugs problem that particularly the United States has had over the past 15 to 20 years, which started when doctors began overprescribing opioids for pain relief. And in some cases, some people who saw the doctor for relatively minor injuries became addicted to these powerful opioids. The drug in question is called Oxycontin, and this was produced by a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, which was largely owned by one particular family called the Sacklers, and they became incredibly wealthy off the back of this drug. And obviously, legal action was taken against them, and they lost. They were found liable for the damages caused by this overprescription of this drug that they produced. They took that to court to limit their liability, and in return for, I think, $6 billion, the lower court found that they could, in fact, limit their future liability. So that would prevent people or individuals or institutions from taking further legal action. Now, this question has gone to the Supreme Court, hence the title here. And the Supreme Court is at the moment scrutinizing that verdict, and it will decide whether to limit their liability or not. So let's have a look in more detail at the article, and as usual, we'll be going over some of the more interesting words. Don't forget to check out some of my other videos. I now have a lot of 1-minute videos which just talk about specifically one item of vocabulary, some of them taken from other videos and some of them original material. And if you like them, don't forget to click on like, because that really gives me positive feedback. So let's kick off with the first paragraph. The US Supreme Court has heard fiery arguments over a bankruptcy deal for Purdue Pharma, which may shield the Sackler family from future lawsuits. The deal, which has been approved by a lower court, would grant legal immunity to the owners of the company that makes Oxycontin, a highly addictive painkiller blamed for fueling the opioid crisis in the US. The deal would also require the Sacklers to pay $6 billion to settle thousands of claims from states, local governments, tribes, and individuals. So if we turn to the first word we have highlighted here, this is the noun bankruptcy. And you will often see this in the phrase to go bankrupt. And this refers to businesses that basically don't make enough money to cover their costs. If their losses become so big that they cannot continue to function as businesses, then they will become bankrupt. We can also express the same idea with phrases such as to go bust or to become insolvent. So let's move on to the next word in the paragraph, which is this word, shield. Now, shield, like we have mentioned before, a lot of words in English can function both as a verb and a noun with exactly the same form, and this is one of those cases. So if we start with a noun, a shield is basically something that protects you from harm. If we go back in time, before we had gunpowder and guns and cannons and things like that, the soldiers used to use swords and shields, and the sword would be for attacking the enemy and the shield would be for protection. A shield was basically a physical barrier, typically made of wood or leather, sometimes with metal parts, and it was very robust. I mean, there were different sizes and different shapes according to the function or the culture from which it came. For example, the Roman army had a particularly large shield, which they could actually use very effectively as a group to create a barrier to protect a large group of soldiers from missiles that were thrown at them. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this can be used as a verb, and it basically has the same meaning there. To shield somebody from something is basically to protect them. Could be from physical harm. Perhaps if there is a dangerous situation, then the police might shield the public from the danger. But it could also be, as is the case in this article, that the shield in question, or the shielding in question, is not physical. It's talking about protecting the Sackler family from the possibility of future lawsuits or legal actions. That is at the heart of this case. The deal is that they pay money, I think it's $6 billion, and that will protect them. It will shield them from further legal actions. Okay, so let's move on to the third word in this paragraph. We have this compound word. We have pain and killer. Individually, well, pain can be a noun which refers to a sensation in the body that happens when we hurt ourselves. So if you have an injury, or if you fall over, or you break your bone or whatever, you would get a very strong pain. There are several words connected with this. For example, hurt is the verb that we use. We also have the word ache, which can be used as a verb or as a noun, and even a noun suffix, as in headache or backache. Killer, on the other hand, would be a person who kills. For example, a murderer is a killer. In this case, the killer in question is not a person. It's kind of idiomatic use, meaning that the pill that we take in order to kill the pain, to stop the pain. So it's another name for those kinds of medicines which are designed to stop pain. In this case, the drug in question is called Oxycontin, and unfortunately, it was, for some people, highly addictive. So let's move on to the next word. We have settle. This is a verb. It's a regular verb. The first thing that springs to mind when I think of settle are settlers, people who in the past voyaged to other lands. Sometimes they're called colonists, and they settled there. They found land and they built communities and established villages and towns and cities that later grew. There are many cases where this has happened throughout history, where there have been migrations of people to other lands. I mean, a case from the country which I come from would be the Vikings. The Vikings were famous for sailing across the sea, and they settled in many areas. Northern France, and they turned into the culture called the Normans, which later invaded England in 1066. But also they settled the whole northeastern half of the country, which would later be known as England. And they actually ruled that area under a system which was called the Danelaw for several hundred years. They also settled in Iceland and the southern part of Greenland, and there is some archaeological evidence that they may have settled even in the very north of continental America, in a place called Vinland. So that is one use of the verb, when you settle and you create a colony. However, there are other uses. It can be used as a phrasal verb. If you settle down, that means that you kind of establish your life. So you've got a stable job. Perhaps you have a stable relationship. Maybe you have kids. You buy a house. That would be an example of settling down. In this particular case, however, we're talking about a legal settlement. So this is quite distinct from the first two examples. So if you take somebody to court, perhaps maybe they have done something that you consider injurious to you. Maybe they've damaged your reputation, so you decide to sue them. You take a legal action, and perhaps the case is quite strong, so the person you're suing decides to settle before it goes to court. So they would actually pay you some compensation in order that you drop the legal action. That would be a case which is quite similar here. The Sacklers, who are the owners of this pharmaceutical company, Purdue, decided to settle the legal action by paying $6 billion to the people who took the action, including individuals, local governments, states, tribes. So let's move on to the next paragraph. However, some states and victims have objected to the deal, arguing that it lets the Sacklers off the hook for their role in creating and profiting from the epidemic that has killed more than 500,000 Americans. This is not justice. This is a mockery of justice, said Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey, who led the opposition to the deal. The Sacklers are not bankrupt. They have not paid a penny out of their own pockets, and they will walk away richer and more powerful than ever. The justices grilled both sides on the legal and moral implications of the deal, which raises complex questions about bankruptcy law, state sovereignty, and public health. So the first word we have here in this paragraph is objected to. So this, again, can be used as a noun or a verb. An object is basically a thing. It's something physical, it's tangible. You can pick it up, you can put it down, you can carry it. Can refer to virtually anything. But as a verb, to object, notice the difference in word stress there. We have object, a thing, and to object. So the stress falls on the second syllable. And to object means that you disagree with something. In this case, some of the states and victims of this crisis, the opioid crisis, have objected to the deal that the Sacklers made. Basically, they have said that this is not just, it's not fair, and they want to have that decision overturned. You can object to anything that you disagree with. For example, in some countries, something controversial like capital punishment or the death penalty exists. But in many other countries around the world, people object to this, and the law has been changed so that that practice is no longer carried out. In the United States, there's a lot of controversy about abortion. Many people support a woman's right to abort a pregnancy, but a lot of other people, sometimes for religious reasons, object to that right. And there has been an ongoing argument about that. Let's move on to the next phrase. This is an idiom, off the hook. In fact, it's to let somebody off the hook is the full phrase. So if we look at the most significant word here, it is hook. And a hook is a device that is used sometimes for hanging things. For example, you could have a coat hook. So that would be a device that you would usually see typically by the front door that you would hang your coat on when you've taken it off. When you've come in and you've taken off your coat, you hang it up on the hook. Other uses for hooks could be in fishing. When you go fishing, one of the ways that you can catch fish is by using a rod with a long line, and on the end of the line there's a hook, and on the end of the hook there is some bait, some food that would attract or lure the fish. When the fish bite that bait, the hook pierces their mouth and they become trapped or caught, and then you can reel in the line and catch the fish. So that's another use of hook. Now, We also use the word hook in several different phrases. I mean, you can be hooked on something, which is another way of saying addicted to. So you could say that many people became hooked on Oxycontin, that opioid that we talked about earlier. In this case, it's to let somebody off the hook basically means that you allow them to escape the consequences of their actions. So instead of hanging them, they are allowed to kind of run away, figuratively. So in this case, what it's saying is that the deal is too lenient. It's allowing the owners of the company, the pharmaceutical company, to escape from the full consequences of their actions. They have been let off the hook. Another example of this could be during the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of those companies that were in danger of becoming bankrupt were let off the hook to some extent because the government bailed them out. They gave them a lot of loans or a lot of financial support to stop them from going bankrupt. So many people have argued that they didn't face the full consequences of their irresponsible actions. They were let off the hook. But it doesn't have to be used in those kind of grand examples. It could be a simple example like the student failed to hand in the project before the deadline, but he had a good excuse, so the teacher let him off the hook. He didn't punish him or penalize him in any way. He was excused or forgiven. Okay, so let's move on to the next word. This is a noun, a mockery, it's pronounced. There is a verb form of this, which is to mock somebody. And if you're mocking somebody, you're basically making fun of them. Teasing them is another verb we use. And it basically means that you're joking, you are kind of imitating them, making them appear stupid or ineffective. This is often seen in schools, I guess, in the context of bullying, if you know what that means. To bully somebody is to pick on them and to victimize them. And often that involves mockery. So somebody who is perhaps a little different from the rest, maybe they're fat or they have an appearance which is different, they could be mocked. They could be the victim of the jokes of the rest of the class. In this case, we can see the article is talking about a mockery of justice. So that indicates that this person believes that this verdict, this result, was not serious. It was a bit of a joke, in fact. And they believe that this decision should be overturned by the Supreme Court. Okay, so let's move on to the next word. This is grill. This is a verb and a noun. It may be familiar to some of you. If you like cooking, you're probably familiar with this word because to grill is actually a way of cooking. Typically, it involves using intense heat either from above or below. Perhaps you've made for yourself a grilled cheese sandwich. In this case, however, it's used idiomatically. So there is no cooking involved in this case. Basically, if you grill somebody, it means you ask them difficult questions. Usually when you imagine you're in an interview and you're asking the candidate some really tough, hard questions, they would usually feel uncomfortable. Perhaps they would actually feel hot and they might start sweating. Perhaps their face goes red with embarrassment and stress. So that is why we use it there, because just like when you're grilling that cheese sandwich, the cheese gets hot and it melts. If you are under intense scrutiny, you almost feel like that cheese sandwich. You get hotter and uncomfortable. So in this case, the judges are grilling both sides of the argument. They're asking them tough questions to try to decide on this deal, whether it should be upheld or overturned. Okay, so let's move on to the final paragraph. A lawyer for some of the plaintiffs expressed skepticism that the deal would provide adequate relief to the victims and their families. How do you look at them and say this settlement is fair? She asked. One of the protesters outside the court was Ellen Isaacs, who lost her son to an opioid overdose 5 years ago. She said that she wanted the Sacklers to face criminal charges and pay more compensation. They're criminals, and they need to be treated as such, she said. The court is expected to issue a ruling by June next year. So the first word we have here is the noun plaintiff. And simply a plaintiff it's a legal word that's really used to describe somebody who's making a legal complaint against somebody else. In this case, the plaintiffs are the victims of the opioid crisis, both organizations and individuals. One thing I will say about this word is be careful, because it sounds very similar, almost identical, in fact, to an adjective which is plaintive. That's spelled T-I-V-E at the end. And plaintive as an adjective just means something that sounds sad or mournful. So quite different meaning, but the sound of it, the pronunciation is very, very similar. So just be aware of that. So moving on to the second word, we have the noun relief. This is often used as an adjective in the form relieved. If you feel relieved, it's almost as if some weight has been lifted from your body. Perhaps you have been studying very hard for your exams, for your end of term exams, and you feel really stressed. And then when you finish the last exam, you feel relief. It's almost as if all of that weight and worry and stress has been suddenly lifted from your body, and you feel much, much better. So it's a happy feeling, really. It can also be used when you avoid some bad consequence as well. So perhaps I'm driving along and somebody steps in front of me, but I manage to avoid them. I do a maneuver and I avoid hitting them, then I would feel very relieved that I didn't have an accident. In this case, it's talking about financial relief that would be provided to the plaintiffs by the Sacklers in the form of the compensation. And it's saying that that relief is not adequate. They should pay more for the damage they've done. Okay, so let's move on to the penultimate word. We have this word fair. So fair has several different uses. In this case, it's an adjective. And when we say something is fair or unfair in this way, we're talking about justice, really. Fairness is related to our sense of justice. So theoretically, the law is supposed to be balanced, it's supposed to be objective, and it's supposed to treat people in a fair way. So it shouldn't matter if you are rich or poor, you should have the same experience of the legal process. If you're guilty, you should be found guilty, and if you're innocent, you should be found innocent. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, or influential, or just a regular person. Now, in practice, of course, that's not always the case. And in this case, it's saying that this proposed settlement isn't fair because they have paid a certain amount of money, but they're saying it's not adequate. You will often hear children who are disobeying their parents saying, "Oh, it's not fair." In other words, they strongly disagree with the judgment of the parent. Perhaps they think that their sibling has got some kind of benefit that they don't have, or something like that. Other uses of this word could be connected with the weather. If we say the weather is very fair, then it just means that it's pleasant, nice, usually sunny and clement, without any wind or rain. We can also talk about somebody who has fair hair or a fair complexion. That means generally that their hair is very light colored, perhaps blonde, and their skin is very white. And finally, we can also talk about a fair as a noun. This is usually a public event, almost like a celebration in some cases, where goods can be bought and sold, and there are usually attractions, perhaps things to eat, things to do. Trade fairs in particular focus on buying and selling of goods. But again, this is a kind of big public event where people come from particular sectors of the economy. Okay, so let's move on to the last word. We have overdose. Now, this is composed of two elements, the prefix over and the noun dose. Well, noun and a verb, dose. So a dose is basically a quantity, a specific measured quantity of something, typically medicines, that is administered to a patient. So when nurses or doctors give medicines, they give it in a specific dose. So it could be measured in milliliters or a certain number of tablets or pills. And with the prefix over added to it, that signifies that the dose is too high. So this is often used in the context of drug abuse. So if people are injecting or in some other way ingesting illegal drugs, it's very important that they don't use too much and overdose. As people use, particularly opioids, as they use them and abuse them, their body becomes resistant to the effects. So they have to use a higher and higher dose. And sometimes it can be the case that they use too much of the drug and they slip into a coma. Perhaps their heart stops and they die. And that is the case with a lot of people who got addicted to opioids. They overdosed and they died, which is why there are so many victims during this crisis. Okay, so there we have it. There's your dose of English news for this week. And until next time, I will say goodbye. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, don't forget to like the video. And I'll see you next time on News for English Learners.